Number 5. The guy who invented hand washing and got thrown into an asylum. So there's this Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis, right? It's the 1840s. Women are dying left and right after childbirth, and every doctor is like, well, that's just how it goes. Must be bad air or ghosts or whatever. But Semmelweis notices something weird. The maternity ward run by doctors has a death rate of like 10%, while the one run by midwives, only 4%. And he's thinking, okay, what's the difference here? Turns out the doctors were doing autopsies in the morning, wiping their hands on their already crusty lab coats, then delivering babies in the afternoon. No soap, no water, just vibes and cadaver particles. Semmelweis puts 2 and 2 together and realizes, oh my god, we're literally killing people with our dirty hands. Revolutionary stuff. So he makes everyone wash their hands with chlorinated lime solution, and boom, the death rate plummets to under 1%. You'd think his colleagues would be thrilled, right? Like, wow, Ignaz, you just saved thousands of lives. Here's a medal. Nope, they were furious. Because admitting that hand washing worked meant admitting that they'd been accidentally murdering women for decades. Doctors back then had egos the size of Austria-Hungary, and Semmelweis was out here calling them all filthy killers. They didn't appreciate it. So what happens? The medical community bullies him relentlessly, refuses to adopt his methods, and basically gaslights him into a nervous breakdown. He starts writing angry letters calling everyone murderers, which, fair, but not great for his reputation. Eventually, his colleagues have him committed to a mental asylum where he's beaten by guards and dies 2 weeks later from infected wounds. Irony so thick you could culture bacteria on it. The man who discovered that cleanliness saves lives died because people couldn't handle being told to wash their hands. Basically, the medical establishment chose pride over soap, and Semmelweis paid the price. Number 4. The astronomer who proved the universe was expanding and got completely overlooked because she was a woman. Henrietta Swan Leavitt, early 1900s. Working at the Harvard College Observatory as a computer, which back then didn't mean she was a machine. It meant she was a woman hired to do tedious calculations for male astronomers who couldn't be bothered. She was basically doing grunt work for pennies while the guys got all the credit and the professorships. But Leavitt was sharp, and she noticed something incredible while studying Cepheid variable stars. There was a relationship between their brightness and how fast they pulsed. This discovery, now called the period luminosity relationship, became the foundation for measuring cosmic distances. It's how Edwin Hubble later proved the universe was expanding. It's how we figured out the scale of the cosmos. It's one of the most important discoveries in astronomy, period. And Leavitt did it while being paid less than a secretary and never being allowed to use a telescope herself. Did she get a Nobel Prize? Nope. Did she even get proper recognition in her lifetime? Barely. She died of cancer in 1921 at the age of 53, and a few years later, a Swedish mathematician tried to nominate her for the Nobel Prize, only to find out she was already dead, and the Nobel isn't awarded posthumously. Edwin Hubble, meanwhile, got all the fame for using her method to make his discoveries, and for decades, people thought he was the genius who figured out cosmic distances. Leavitt's name was buried in the footnotes. She was too smart for a system that didn't want women doing real science, and her safety, her career, her recognition, her legacy was sacrificed on the altar of sexism and academic gatekeeping. She changed our understanding of the universe and got nothing but a quiet death and a delayed, oh yeah, she was important, 100 years later. Number 3. The mathematician who solved an impossible problem and got murdered for being a know-it-all. Évariste Galois, French, teenager, absolute menace to the mathematical establishment. This kid, and I mean kid, he was like 20 when he died, basically invented an entire branch of math called group theory, which is now fundamental to modern algebra and physics. He was solving problems that stumped the best mathematicians in Europe, and he was doing it while failing his university entrance exams because he thought the questions were too boring to bother with. But here's the thing about Galois. He had zero patience for idiots. He'd submit papers to the French Academy of Sciences, and they'd lose them or reject them because they didn't understand what he was talking about. He'd try to explain, they'd dismiss him, and he'd call them incompetent frauds, which, again, fair, but not exactly a career-building strategy. He also got really into revolutionary politics, which in 1830s France was a one-way ticket to prison. He got arrested multiple times for being a loud, anti-monarchy activist, and the authorities were just waiting for an excuse to get rid of him. That excuse came in the form of a duel. The details are murky, but most historians think it was over a woman, or possibly a setup by political enemies who wanted him dead. Either way, Galois knew he was probably going to die, So the night before the duel, he stayed up writing down all of his mathematical theories in a frantic letter to a friend, basically saying, "Hey, if I don't make it, please make sure someone understands this stuff." He got shot in the stomach the next morning, died the day after, and his work sat in a drawer for over a decade before anyone bothered to read it. When they finally did, they realized he'd been right about everything. Too smart, too loud, too revolutionary. Literally, his safety was never an option. Number 2. The chemist who discovered fluorine and almost died 7 times doing it. Okay, so fluorine is one of the most violently reactive elements on the periodic table. It will literally set water on fire. It corrodes glass. It explodes when it touches organic matter. It's basically the chemical equivalent of a rabid wolverine, and for most of the 1800s, trying to isolate it in pure form was considered a suicide mission. Multiple chemists died or were permanently injured trying. And then along comes Henri Moissan, a French pharmacist who apparently looked at this nightmare element and thought, yeah, I can take it. Moissan spent years getting poisoned. He'd inhale fluorine gas, nearly die, recover, then go right back to the lab like nothing happened. He tried electrolysis in different solvents, built custom equipment out of platinum because everything else would just disintegrate, and kept meticulous notes while his lungs were actively dissolving. In 1886, he finally succeeded in isolating pure fluorine, and the scientific community was like, holy crap, he actually did it. He won the Nobel Prize in 1906 for his work. But here's the thing. Moissan's body was wrecked. Chronic fluorine poisoning had destroyed his health. He developed severe respiratory issues, constant fatigue, and died just a few years after winning the Nobel at the age of 54. Some historians think the fluorine exposure directly shortened his life. So yeah, he got the glory, he got the prize, but he also got a slow, painful death courtesy of the element he dedicated his life to understanding. His colleagues basically watched him sacrifice himself for science, and while they respected the work, they also thought he was out of his mind for pushing it that far. Too smart, too stubborn, too willing to trade his lungs for legacy. Number 1. The woman who proved chromosomes matter and got erased from history. Meet Nettie Stevens, a geneticist in the early 1900s who figured out one of the most fundamental things about biology, that sex is determined by chromosomes, specifically the X and Y chromosomes. She was studying mealworms, because apparently that's what you do when you're a genius with no funding, and noticed that males had 1 large chromosome and 1 small one, while females had 2 large ones. She connected the dots and published her findings in 1905. Groundbreaking, right? Wrong. Well, right, but also completely ignored, because at the same time, a dude named Edmund Wilson, her former teacher and a well-respected scientist, published similar findings. Guess whose name ended up in the textbooks? Not Nettie's. For decades, Wilson got most of the credit, even though Stevens had done the definitive work. She was polite about it, kept her head down, kept working. But the scientific community of the time wasn't interested in giving a woman her due, even when she literally discovered how biological sex works. And here's the kicker. She died of breast cancer at 50, just a few years after her discovery, so she didn't have time to fight for her legacy. Meanwhile, Wilson lived into his 80s and got to bask in the glory of work that wasn't entirely his. It wasn't until decades later that historians started saying, hey, wait a second, Stevens actually did this first. But by then, she'd already been written out of the story. Too smart, too quiet, too female. Her safety? She lost it to obscurity and erasure, which in science is basically a death sentence for your ideas. The world moved on without her, and she became a footnote in someone else's chapter.